Hi Gemma, thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Yep, I'm great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
First of all, if you'd just like to give a bit of background about yourself and just what you do, and what brought you to us having a conversation today.
So my name's Jen. I am the founder of ND Warriors and an ADHD ambassador as well with ADHD UK. I am a very late diagnosed neurodivergent woman. I was only diagnosed at a point of crisis in my life after a really, really difficult time. I think I wanted to then do something as part of my healing process, because one of the things that I found really difficult was getting over that grief element of feeling like I'd lost so many opportunities in my life, or that I'd missed things that other people had been able to experience. A lot of that as a result of trauma. So I am a survivor of abuse as well. I've had abusive relationships, and that's caused very long-standing complex issues which have taken me years and years to try and recover through, and it's probably going to be an ongoing lifelong battle really in managing that. And I'm really passionate about making sure that we are discussing how we can prevent those harms going forward. Those harms wouldn't need to have happened if the recognition had been there and I'd had the tools and mechanisms to protect myself. So this is why I am speaking up and speaking at community events and talking to people and delivering training in the workplace about recognising vulnerabilities, particularly in neurodivergent young people, and trying to give them the skills and tools to be able to protect themselves and give themselves a bit of resilience.
Yeah, and it's really important that you're shedding light on that, because I feel like it's not a conversation that is discussed very often at all. And when we spoke briefly last time, just around the statistics of abuse and people with neurodiversity, quite wild, to be fair. It's really shocking to me. After that, I came away really thinking about that after our conversation, and it's alarming that it's at a stage of where it is, but it also got me thinking a lot about what we can do to change that as well. I think first and foremost is a conversation like this one to shed awareness. Obviously, with your role in your day job, what are the statistics that we talked through last time? Where are they at? Just give a brief explanation of those and what the actual situation is looking like for in terms of abuse and neurodivergent people right now.
So I think one of the things that everybody in this community can probably agree on is that research around ADHD and neurodiversity as a whole is not there in the way that we'd want it to be, even less so for women, which is really frustrating. But there's a couple of really interesting pieces of research. There's one by the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry, and that talks about a threefold increase in people with, or young women with ASD experiencing abuse, and around a twofold increase for women with women with ADHD experience abuse. Now, if we're looking at the standard statistics that neurotypical women and girls will experience abuse of about 25%, we are looking at around 90% for young girls with ASD, and around 67% of girls and young women with ADHD experiencing abuse sort of by the age of 18. There's another piece of research as well that backs this up, which is on PubMed, so it's easily accessible, which talks about how 9 out of 10 autistic girls, and does go into the ADHD figures, but the research was more focused on ASD. So we are talking about up to 90% of neurodivergent young girls and women being exposed to abuse purely because of the vulnerabilities that they're facing, the lack of understanding social cues, the inability to be able to maybe read people in the same way and understand those nuances that we see in society, particularly when girls are hitting puberty and they are trying to read people and they're trying to grow up and understand this world, and they feel peer pressure. All of these things will contribute to a misunderstanding which can lead them into these really difficult situations.
Yeah, and for those situations to occur, I think there's multiple failings in different areas, isn't there?
Yeah.
Is there any particular failing that you would highlight, from whether that's the likes of national government or the education system, that potentially leads to this?
I think there's a couple of factors that we need to take into account. So we know that typically girls are much more undiagnosed than boys are. So it tends to be girls that are more often victims of abuse compared to young boys, although obviously, violence against boys and men is clearly an issue as well. But if we're talking specifically about violence against women and girls are typically less recognised, so girls tend to mask more. I think there is an issue there, not because it's a failing, but there is an issue with a lack of understanding with parents and education providers about recognising that some of these vulnerabilities are there. I've had conversations with teachers where they have spoken about girls being quiet and they are quite introverted and they struggle, and then we find out 10 years later that they have never felt like they fitted in, and they've been victims of abuse because they haven't seen and read the social cues which has left this in this position. But we didn't take the chance to recognise that when they were 9, 10, 11 years old and they were feeling like an outcast in their own classroom. So this could be something about a parent talking to their child in a slightly different way, or this could be something around how a teacher maybe recognises those signs at that sort of prepubescent time and just speaking to them in a different way. I think the lack of diagnosis is difficult, but I do think even with support providers, we're not talking about these figures enough for even support mechanisms of diagnosed girls to be really raising this and logging in and really focusing on those social needs that they have to keep them safe. So I think that's where we're missing. I think education has to play a part, but parents have to play a part too. I think society as a whole would be so much better if we could get together and protect them and make these young girls safer by actually eradicating abuse. That would be the ideal situation. But we have to be realistic. And as a result, we have to make sure that we are giving them the tools and the resilience to be able to prevent those harms so they don't deal with lifelong anxiety, they don't deal with lifelong depression or lifelong eating disorders, which is what we see in so many late diagnosed women.
You spoke about your own late diagnosis and obviously the grief that came with that. And from just there speaking about girls that feel like they don't fit in at a young age, potentially masking signs of ADHD and autism, which then leads to a late diagnosis. Do you think an early diagnosis might help with not only help them kind of fit in, but do you think an early diagnosis could help go towards reducing the number of cases of abuse in young people that we see, especially with neurodivergent?
Absolutely. I think there's no question about it. I think when you give people the tools to be empowered to understand themselves, they're more likely to be able to recognise and to be able to adapt themselves to the social norms of the world because they have an understanding of this is happening in my body, I feel this way because of this. Children and young people are no different. I think we very often treat neurodivergent children and young people and we wrap them up in cotton wool and we want to protect them from the world. But it's sort of by the ages that I'm talking about and really wanting to target, these children are able to start thinking intuitively. They're able to start building those resilience platforms. They're able to start learning about social cues, maybe in a different way to some other neurotypical children. But they're very clever individuals and they have the skills and the abilities to do it. They just need a helping hand to learn those. Diagnosis is going to be a major one. I think if we can talk to support services, if we can speak to diagnosticians and NHS services, and we can speak to the likes of Women's Aid as well, and we can speak to domestic abuse charities and organisations to get that understanding out there of these risks and vulnerabilities, and we can start spreading that and getting that education embedded in professionals, then that diagnosed section will hopefully encompass learning some of these social skills. There are things like life coaching available for young people, which is there specifically to do life skills, and that's fantastic, but that's not always easy to access. It's not always cheap to access if you go with a private provider. And in my opinion, what we really should be doing is making sure that this is free, because this isn't just somebody wanting to do better or get a promotion. This is a young person's life and the future of how successful they can be. We hear that the Prime Minister wants us all to be successful and wants us all to be in work and working with these challenges. And most neurodivergent people, young people, can be successful. There's nothing to stop us thriving and succeeding. But without the investment there in those support services to support them in that diagnostic journey, or even a sort of non-diagnostic, that recognition in education, without that investment in preventative measures and that preventative learning, simply isn't going to see that change that he wants to see, certainly not for neurodivergence, because we are still battling those lifelong outfalls of trauma.
Yeah, and with the amount of the population that have ADHD or autism as well, with the condition being genetic, that's only a percentage that's going to keep rising. So
Yeah.
I think we touched on it briefly last time we spoke about tackling the issue early, I guess, didn't we, in terms of making a change now for, like you say, for that future of where we get more people in work, especially people with neurodivergence that can add so much to the workplace as well. But I think the difficulty is that there is a lack of support in, well, clearly the education system and the workplace as well, which leaves people to be not only feeling left out in the school years, but also in adult years as well, when they don't feel like they're able to fit into the social norms. And like you said before about social cues, being able to read those and things like that, it just makes it really difficult to achieve that without any clear action of making things like diagnosis accessible, because it's really difficult, especially with late diagnosis. How did you find the experience of going through that diagnosis?
Pretty terrible. I reached crisis point before somebody on a crisis phone line. I'm very lucky to have a crisis line through my employer, and it was through a crisis phone line when I was at my wit's end that the lady on the other end of the phone said, "Do you ever think you could be neurodivergent?" And at that point I had no concept of what that meant. I had no idea. I was very much blind to it, and I'm not big into social media, so TikTok isn't really my thing, although this was a couple of years ago. So I think the sort of ADHD conversation had started, but I'd been very, very blinded to that conversation. And it's really strange because I have 2 children, and those children both exhibit symptoms of this. And we couldn't explain those behaviours, and we have had no end of challenges for years with these experiences. And it wasn't until I sort of stopped at that crisis point and they said, right, well, we need to get you some help because you are at crisis. And it was only then that I really picked up. And I don't use the NHS services. I think I am managing thankfully very effectively with other support mechanisms at the moment, but that's out of necessity rather than having the access and deciding not to do that. The way that I manage is purely because there isn't the services available in my area to be able to make those available to me. So I think it's a real issue, and like you mentioned, the genetic issue, and I think one of the biggest things for me, and one of the biggest things that sort of really struck for me in going through this process of learning about what neurodivergence means for me and some of the reasons for why I have been different all of these years, is I have a daughter, and my biggest fear is that I didn't know and I wasn't recognising that I could keep my daughter safe from the harms that I'd experienced. And I've been able to work with her and focus on that since learning about all of these things, and I've been able to talk to her about understanding those behaviours and social cues that might lead her to a position to build her up the resilience. And I think one of the things that worries me is that we have a generation of women out there who have experienced abuse as well, who don't know that they could be the stop in their line and they could stop that harm if they had this understanding, if we knew this. But the messages just aren't getting out there. ADHD is a difficult topic for people to talk about at the moment because people are so polarised with how they feel about it. But talking about abuse and ADHD is just something that is just not being tackled, and it's something that we really need to, because we could stop an entire generation of harm by getting these messages out and getting the support. So if we do have girls, even if they are pre-diagnosis on these lists, because we know these lists are there, my question is, what are we doing to help parents learn and understand and support their children? What are we doing to help education providers to make sure that those messages are being translated in a way that these girls can understand, so that we can provide those protections? We can prevent the mental health issues. We can prevent the disabling trauma that comes with a lifelong issues like depression, anxiety, and the raft of other issues that come along with it.
With the amount of people that's been through that abuse, and you spoke quite openly about yourself being one of those victims of abuse previously, there's so much there that's to deal with afterwards in terms of like the anxiety, depression and things like that, and the cost of that to the National Health Service, local governments, well, national governments. If that money was used better and put into preventative measures, then there wouldn't need to be that cost for where that's in terms of like medication for anxiety, depression, and even counselling for trauma as well. All the costs of that can be eradicated by simply looking at preventative measures first.
Absolutely.
Do you think that it starts with the biggest start is with the education system, and in terms of maybe some safeguarding policies in schools, and to be able to spot ADHD earlier as well.
I think there has to be a societal shift in culture, and the point that you've made about saving the NHS money is such a valid one, and it's one that, you know, with all the conversations around the benefits reform and PIP as well at the moment, is a really big one for me, because as somebody who is disabled and protected, if I wanted to claim PIP for counselling services, I could pay for private counselling, but the NHS provision just isn't funded enough. We don't have enough counsellors to deal with it. So let's look at how we can shift that funding into that prevention. And then you don't have all of those co-harms. You don't have all of that trauma that you're dealing with, like you said, that could cost the NHS tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds every year, trying to manage lifelong illnesses that people don't need to struggle with, and you're giving people their lives back before it's even started. So I think, recognising it in the school place is a big thing. I think I'm a bit of a realist in the sense of we aren't going to fix the diagnostic delays overnight. It's one of those things. I think you can pump billions of pounds into this now. We simply don't have enough people in the country to be able to diagnose everybody on the waiting list. So it's not like this is a quick fix. So I think this really has to be a sort of multidisciplinary education sharing space. Education, it's not so much about teaching in specific classes, like you say. It's just about recognizing. It's about, in those safeguarding policies, asking a slightly different question. It isn't just looking at the children who are very, very loud and outspoken and have those issues. It's about looking at the girl that sat in the corner that is maybe feeling very introverted and very low, and seeing if there are different ways to bring them out. We know that traditional classrooms aren't great for neurodivergent children, and we learn in a different way anyway, and that's all it could be. But if we're asking the questions and saying, well, you know, and somebody, if a child makes an admission and says something around, you know, I've been speaking to somebody, and it's just asking the question in a slightly different way to say, you know, is this, you know, trying to work out whether this is something that could be cause for concern. And we don't have the time to do that. Education providers aren't able to make the time to do that because we're not giving it the recognition it needs. I think a lot of it has to fall on parents, and that's not because of any fault. I think the sort of fault and failure word of things is things that I'm trying to actively avoid, because the vast majority of the population don't know about these issues. And so really my job really is to just make awareness. It's just to come out and say this and talk parents through this and say, actually, maybe we need to be thinking about how you teach your children about behaviours and social cues in the home as well. Because I think a lot of it is going to fall down on that. I don't think there is a failure of anyone necessarily. I think the failure is coming from just that lack of sharing this knowledge about what is going on. We know that so many of this is occurring, and we've got anecdotal evidence coming out of our ears that this is happening. We're just not talking about it. I think that's where we need to be. And social media is a really great tool for that, and something that we have to be getting on board with.
I think there's a couple of points there from what you were saying. Just firstly, you said about speaking with the sort of loud and outspoken child, you know, and dealing with them in a different way. I think stigma probably plays a part in being able to have those conversations, I guess, and recognise that in other children for, you know, some education providers, because they are probably in that mindset still of neurodivergence. ADHD is those children that will get thrown out of class because they are being loud. I think that's just the kind of standard of society, is that attention is always put on the people that are the loudest, and it's not going to benefit anything like being able to tackle, you know, any potential abuse that might be going on or somebody could be subject to, because they are masking and are the quieter ones in the classroom. So I think there needs to be more awareness, by bringing awareness about what ADHD looks like in both boys and girls during, you know, younger years. I think that can definitely help to change that in terms of support that's provided in schools.
It would be great if we as a society would be more welcoming of adults in the workplace to be open about their ADHD and neurodiversity, because when I've spoken to people, and I've spoken to a couple of teachers, and they've gone, actually, I'm neurodivergent, and I think, well, You know, in the neurodivergent world, there's a sort of ongoing joke that we've got a bit of a radar and we can tell other neurodivergent people. It makes me question why we aren't championing these teachers as these fantastic, amazing beacons who would also be able to not diagnose, but might be able to pick out, you know, these are successful people who have developed a career. And these are people that we can use as role models for our young people to say, well, actually, whether you're neurodivergent or not, you might feel slightly isolated, you might feel slightly different, but actually this adult felt the same, and having those conversations would help, and not just about abuse and grooming and those things, but also about a range of other behavioural things where we can use that and really champion them. And we're talking about making these teachers the real beacons of light in these schools, because we aren't championing them enough in that workplace.
And there's still that stigma in the workplace as well, isn't there? I was speaking to somebody the other day who had a discussion with their HR department at work, and to disclose the fact that they'd got ADHD, and they felt that the way the conversation went was that almost the HR department felt like they were putting it on record as a sort of excuse for any potential performance issues or things like that, which is really disappointing to hear, because generally it's not the case that whilst the stigma is like the kid getting kicked out of school, you think of an adult with ADHD, but you don't think of them getting sacked from every job. So it's quite the opposite, I think, in terms of being able to bring more creativity into the workplace and think outside the box, bring new ideas. So it's disappointing that doesn't translate to how it's dealt with within certain workplaces. There's not really a uniform approach across businesses, and there's no sort of policies of how we tackle this. There's been a big shift in inclusion in the workplace over the last 10-20 years, being inclusive potentially to come, hopefully, for neurodivergence, and create more awareness around what that might look like and how people can support their colleagues who may not feel like they're quite fitting in at work, but they still have so much to offer.
Absolutely. Not that I'm promoting anybody's book or anything like that, but I ended up buying Rich and Rox's Addie and Me book when they released that recently from ADHD Love. And the one thing that really struck me, so I bought that for my child to try and help bed that in. And there's a really great point at the end of that book where they talk about a different teacher coming in and working with that pupil, and suddenly it was all accepted, and it was because they had an Addie too. And I really loved the visual in that book, because it was absolutely spectacular for teaching a young person a really spectacular way of really championing that child and that ability, but also a really fantastic way, from in my perspective, of championing that teacher and championing that workplace, and just showing what we're capable of doing as well. We can really touch and change people's lives. Whether you're a teacher, or whether you're a civil servant, or whether you're a bus driver, you know, there is something in there that you can really touch and change people. And we are so lucky, in a way, to have the creative ability to think in a different way, to think in these really imaginative and creative ways. But we often don't get the ability and the space and freedom to do that. So it would be fantastic if we could do that. And I think that will then, all of this will feed down into that next generation. And this is how we change culture, and this is how we change society, by feeding that down bit by bit, by doing these things one by one, but actually focusing on all of these different areas, rather than just going, we just need input into diagnosis. Actually, we need preventative funding into education. We need more community involvement and community groups. There's so few community groups now that I've really realised in my sort of time going and speaking to people. It baffles me how few community groups there are for mothers, for example, of babies over 1 year old. I'm dumbfounded at how few opportunities there are for people to get together in their communities. And it's that we really need to be able to shift that and to start getting those messages out there without sitting a child down in a class and saying, well, if somebody says this to you, you have to say that. That's not going to work.
Just speaking about what we're doing as a society to bring people together, it took me back a little bit to a conversation I had with previous guest Emily Sinclair, who's a teacher and ADHD coach, that holds free workshop for parents to discuss what ADHD looks like, if it's understanding if they might potentially be neurodivergent without realising, and then also how it shows up in children and how they can support their children. And that for me was the first that I'd heard of anything like that. So I think that just echoes your point on, in terms of communities, we can definitely do something more to bring people together, because I think there's so much power in sharing experiences. For anyone that's listening that may not have access to a community group, what advice would you give to somebody, parent that's potentially listening to this, that has a child with ADHD, autism, that might just be struggling to find the right way to approach the situation?
I think it's really important when you're discussing these sorts of things in particular. The one thing I found is that people don't tend to be very responsive, or young people don't tend to be very responsive if you just sit them down and tackle it. This has to be built into those everyday conversations, so it takes time. This isn't something that can be solved just by sitting down and going, actually, you know that you're experiencing a bit of bullying at school. Actually, if you tell them this, then this is going to go away. It doesn't work like that. It has to be built up as a process. I would say that there will be things within most people's areas, whether that's paid for by the health board or paid for by the education system, or there's likes of sort of preventative measures like resilient families and other such measures, which will be available in your area. Your school should know those things. And then if they're not in school and you still want to have those conversations, it's just about sort of talking about, okay, well, taking an example, a group of boys asked me to hang out after school. Okay, that sounds great. So who are your friends have they asked? Have they asked you to meet? Have they asked you not to tell anyone? And it's starting to ask the questions around situations that are happening every day. Because if you embed it in, then they get the opportunity to sort of critically challenge their own thinking without being too in your face of, my mum or dad is telling me to do this. We know that children, particularly of a certain age, will start to become rebellious. So if you tackle it and go, you're not doing that because I think you're going to be abused, it's not going to work. More often than not, it's not going to work. But if you start asking these questions, okay, well, how do you know these people, and where did you meet them? If you met them online, okay, did you meet them? Are they friends of school friends? It's asking it in a much more subtle way so that you can get the answers that you need to make that determination, but you can help them come to their own conclusion, have the skills and the capacity to do it. And what I found most successful is when you allow them to come to those conclusions themselves. They get the learning as part of that process, and it's embedded them without getting an outright, no, you're not doing this. So that would be my sort of top tip. I'd also sort of say that if there's anybody that is really, really struggling, to reach out, like I said, to your school. There will be services available. It's just who knows. And if you're really struggling, feel free to reach out to me on social media or via my website contact form. I'm happy to do that searching with you. That's one thing I would never want anybody to feel is alone in having these conversations. So please do reach out to somebody like me or somebody in your community who might know that. We can feel very alone as parents, particularly if we're worried about our children and we're not sure. So it's always better to try and ask the question. It might sound like a dumb question, but it might save your child from a lifetime of heartache. It can be supportive in that, then I'm pretty certain that everybody would want to do that.
I think having a conversation early on like that will go a long way then to not only preventing things like abuse, but also helping them to fit into society as well. Absolutely.
I think it's taking on that sort of coaching mindset, isn't it? Without maybe using the authoritative mindset. And this is how, society is trying to encourage us to raise our children nowadays, is let them make their decisions for themselves. But we need to be able to lead them in doing so in the right way to prevent it. And I just think because people aren't aware and people aren't diagnosed as well, so people don't know to be aware or not, people just don't know to ask those questions in a slightly different way just to get to that slightly different answer, to make the person think about it in that way that actually this might not be right.
I think we've all been there. We've all been teenagers. We've all probably experienced that authoritative kind of tone from parents before, and that we've been quite dismissive too. So being able to ask a question rather than telling directly can, make so much more of a difference just in that mindset of that person hearing that, because you're going to be less dismissive and more open to a conversation rather than being felt like you're told what to do. Absolutely.
And I think with emotions, it's really important to recognise as well that, your young person will have their own feelings and emotions. And, we can only protect them so much. So we have to embed this into something that they can do naturally, rather than they feel like they are always following somebody else's rules, because they might have complex emotions that they are feeling that we don't understand. They might, make friends with people who are, not necessarily good for them. They might have that peer pressure, but might not want to let go of that. And we as parents, it's probably too easy for us to say, well, they're not good for you, so you can't do that, or you can't be involved with them. And that's probably, as a parent myself, that is far too easy for me to sit in that position and say, I don't like that person, I don't want you spending time with them. But I have to respect as well, my children have their own emotions and feelings, and it isn't as simple as that. So it really is about embedding that almost without that understanding of what we're doing. It has to be subtle, but it has to be able to infiltrate. And I think open questions and starting that dialogue is by far the most effective way I've found to do it. And there is plenty of resources out there that can help you to do that as well, from children from a much younger age, so that you aren't giving in to everything that they say. It isn't about being a pushover to your children, it's about protecting them, but allowing them to come to that protection themselves and build that resilience and give them the tools and skills that they need to challenge their thinking so that they can continue to do that as they grow up. And so when they are going out as a teenager, or they go off and move out for the first time, those skills are already embedded. Those challenging critical thought processes are there, and they're instilled in their brain as a habit. And we've got that in there to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing I want to touch on as well is you mentioned earlier about being an ambassador of ADHD UK. What does being an ambassador for ADHD UK entail, and what does that look like?
I became an ambassador at the beginning of this year. I wanted to make sure that I was doing something and feel like I was doing something. So I am diagnosed with ADHD, and being an ambassador to me meant that I could realistically feel like I could be actively involved in this push towards improving the position on ADHD in society. It meant that I could get my voice heard in the workplace and say, well, I have this backing, I am an ambassador and I am here to talk about this. And it really empowered me to be able to go and start talking more openly about that. I think possibly as an ADHDer, maybe I had a bit of imposter syndrome. I felt like I wasn't necessarily convinced I could do this. I wasn't sure I could come and talk to people about my diagnosis, my lived experience. This is all quite new for me to be talking about lived experience, really. But I really wanted to. It was really important to me. And being an ambassador has meant that I have been able to get involved in conversations with political members, with council members. I've been able to talk and learn so much from fellow ambassadors as well through our sort of connections. The amount that I've learned from fellow ambassadors has been absolutely mind-blowing. We are able to as well raise money for ADHD UK, which is great, which is enabling ADHD UK to continue on the great work they're doing and the services that they provide. So I can direct people to ADHD UK now, and also know and be aware that the money that I'm contributing through fundraising and my own contributions is also helping other people, which is really, really powerful for me, because that's really what I want to do. I never want to see another young girl traumatised. I never want to see another young person in their 20s misdiagnosed with a personality, just going through trauma, going through severe anxiety their entire life because they have dealt with things they shouldn't deal with. So it gives me a number of mechanisms to be able to start carrying out this work and to be able to start really knowing that I'm adding worth to the fight, as it were. I think that's what it is. I'm able to talk about the charity, which is doing fantastic work. Ian spoke in Parliament to the ADHD task force, and he did a sterling job, and so we are really getting there to the people that matter and to the policymakers that are going to make a difference, and that charity is doing that, so I'm really excited to be a part of it.
And it is really powerful that you have that backing, like you say, that organisation, so then you can go and talk about it and have that confidence as well, because that's really important. And as you say, imposter syndrome plays, it's people with ADHD suffer with that a lot more.
It's so hard to put yourself out there for that first time, isn't it? It's so difficult.
And you can feel like feeling like you've got the right to talk about it is often a kind of big challenge in itself. So knowing you have that support of ADHD UK on side to be able to go and have those kind of conversations is really important. For anyone who's not necessarily aware of the work that ADHD UK does and the resources available, because I know we've talked about what resources might be available locally to people, but what resources are available with ADHD UK that people listening to this, whether they've got ADHD themselves or maybe have a child that's got ADHD, what can they kind of call on from ADHD UK to help support them?
Yeah, so ADHD UK, their website has a huge number of resources available. There is an awful lot of information on there to start with that will help you with everything from pre-diagnosis and symptoms, which you might be able to relate to, and talking about what some of these things mean. There is information there about pathways in different areas. So it talks about right to choose, it talks about NHS diagnosis, it talks about private diagnosis. There's also a marketplace there that will be able to link you up with services that might be more local to you if you're wanting to do some therapies, or you wanting the coaching like we've talked about already, but if you wanted to do therapies or other sorts of ADHD support mechanisms by people who are trained and accredited and qualified to be able to provide those services, so that you know that those people are a contributor to this sort of wider cause, to this mission that ADHD has. There is sort of all sorts of diagnostic considerations. Like I said, there is plenty of resources there and information for parents, for children, for teens, for everyone in between, people who are undiagnosed and post-diagnosed, and then some signposting available as well.
Thanks for sharing that information, because it's really important that people know that there is those tools available, because I think especially with late diagnosis, sometimes you can feel like you don't know where to turn. So having a charity that works nationally, that is able to signpost you in the right areas to get the support that you may need, is really important. And it's fantastic that there's people like you that are shining a light on that and being that voice, so more people are aware of it as well. So really well done to you as well, from sharing about your personal experiences to have been through what you have been through, and then coming through that late diagnosis and dealing with the kind of, I guess, baggage of that comes with inevitably, to be able to come through that and still have that drive to fight for the awareness that I think the ADHD deserves, and the light that people with ADHD kind of need at the moment to enable that change in places like the workplace and schools and things like that. It's a real testament to you, Jen. Really, fantastic work on that. Please keep sharing as well. I've spoken to a lot of people that have been late diagnosed and misdiagnosed as well. You talked a little bit about that kind of grief period after your diagnosis. Can you just maybe share a little bit of how you overcome that period? Because I'm sure there's probably a lot of people listening to this that have been through the same.
It's a really good opportunity for me to be able to share that as well. I think if I'm being candid and honest, I think I'll carry that grief period, or a niggle of it, and I expect to carry that for the rest of my life. I think I'm very fortunate that having ADHD, I have a remarkable sense of justice, and that's what has helped me to overcome this, is finding a purpose to help. It's really leaning into one of my ADHD strengths. But that took a number of years, I would say, from finding out that I was diagnosed with ADHD. It took an awfully long time. That grief period led me to some very dark places. Unfortunately, the NHS just wasn't there to be able to support me in that. But I did use other services. I used services. So I have used Resilient Families. I have used other services like that in the community, because the NHS funding, unfortunately, just isn't available to us all. And I would strongly recommend, particularly for parents, to be able to reach out to those community services as well. Services for single people too, and I'm more than happy to help if I can help people find those services, because they're all sorts of services available for people of all backgrounds and current situations. That was a big thing for me, was actually engaging, which is probably the hardest thing to do for me. I'm probably not the most social person in the world. I'm not great with meeting new people, but I did a few events, and that was really empowering for me and really helped me to start moving in the right direction. Therapy is one thing that I would always recommend to people who have been through any form of trauma. Medication is wonderful, but we know that there are complexities between things like ADHD and antidepressants, SAIDs. We know that there are challenges, and they're not always the most effective way to go about it. So I would say is work with the NHS, work with your employer if you have that available, work with other services, particularly if we are talking about abuse and trauma. There are all sorts of charitable services which can provide some really therapeutic support, which would be a great help to you there. But I think it's just talking, it's getting out there, which is sometimes the hardest thing to do when you're going through grief. But it's really important, and then it can really help you to start to rebuild and find that focus. For me, this was my focus. It was getting out there and trying to protect young girls of the future, trying to protect my child, trying to protect my children's friends, trying to protect the future generation and trying to stop that. We are seeing our ambassadors, for example, there's so many of us from a range of backgrounds, and we're all there for the same purpose. We're all there to help others and to really push from that. So if finding that is what you really need, it could be exercise, it could be a book obsession, it could be windsurfing, I don't know, but there has to be something that you will find to bring you out of that process. But I think accepting, and I've accepted that now, that candidly I will always carry a bit of resentment and a bit of grief, spurs me on rather than brings me down now. I've been through that down phase. I've had to reach out to services to help me through that down phase. But now I can use that to really drive me forward and produce something good for the world.
Yeah, it's really powerful, the work that you're doing and continue to do in shedding light on all the kind of areas and issues around ADHD that we experience on a daily basis as well. And thanks for sharing your personal experience. I think it's a really good point that you made about trying to find something that you will be almost obsessed about, I guess, and passionate in the right way, in a good way, but passionate about, that you can then put your energy into to be able to overcome that grief and those feelings that can bring you down around a late diagnosis, and those thoughts which are inevitable of, what if I'd known this sooner? How would have that impacted me? Could it have avoided X, Y, Z? Would I have made different decisions in these situations and things like that? I think is a really powerful thing to take away from that, because it's very easy to go down that rabbit hole of being stuck in that negative feeling. It's a really valuable piece of advice, is seeking things like therapy, support groups, and then just finding something personally away from that you can do to help you bring yourself out of that.
I think ADHD UK also have online support groups as well, which might be useful if people are really struggling. So there's that aspect too, if people wanted to learn more and were maybe in that stage of grief. There is that too, as an online resource.
And it's great that there's more resources becoming available now as well to help people through those, because there's currently over 500,000 people on the waiting list still that have either probably maybe been through that stage already when the realisation has been there to then go for a diagnosis, or they may still be unsure and are yet to experience that. So it's going to be really vital, those kind of services going forward. If people are wanting to have a conversation with you, I know you said you're not good with speaking with new people, but if people are wanting to reach out to you and hear more about your journey and how they can learn to, whether that's support their children who are neurodivergent, what's the best way they can reach you? What platforms are you available on?
I'm available on the normal sort of social medias, so I'm available on Instagram as ND Warrior. I'm also available on LinkedIn as Jen Turnbull, and I'm also available as well via the website. So I've got a website which I'm just starting to pull together to start pulling this information through, to put all of the tips that we've talked about today, to put conversation ideas, and also to give people a space to be able to talk about their own experiences. So that should be ready hopefully in the next couple of weeks, and there is a contact form on there already if you wanted to reach out. So that's ND Warriors.
Amazing, and I look forward to seeing your website as well, and the fantastic resources that are going to be available on there. And I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and have a chat with me about this, about some really key issues in society, especially around young people and young girls as well, that are neurodiverse, that potentially may be subject to things like abuse. It's a topic that just isn't talked about enough. So thank you for coming on and sharing your experiences. Those statistics around that really stand out, and hopefully there'll be a lot more action in future as well going forward from this, especially with the work that you're doing. Hopefully we can get a lot of change going in the education system and just in society in general, the workplace as well. I think it's really key that we have more conversations about this, spread awareness. So thank you for your time and sharing all your insights today.
No, I'm so grateful for the platform, John. I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to come and have a chat with you. It's been fantastic.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Jen.
All right, thanks. See you soon.